Hi, everyone, and welcome to the WriteHive Conference 2024. I'm so glad to be back here again with all of you and getting a chance to talk to all of these lovely panelists. I am your moderator, Basil. My pronouns are he, they, z, but they, them is also fine. Uh, I've been doing this for 2 years now, so, this has been a lot of fun, and I'm glad to be back and talking about this particular subject of monsters and robots, because gosh, do I love robots. And we'll go ahead and turn it over to our wonderful panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, I am XM Moon, with the exception of one weird fluke, which was a contemporary almost romance that I put out last year, the exclusive author of Queer Monsters and Sometimes Robots. I'm also a freelance editor, and this is my third WriteHive conference, so I'm excited to be back.
Hello, I'm Kristin Jacques, and I'm currently writing a queer paranormal series.
Hi, I'm Makana. I use they, she, or he pronouns. I am a sci-fi author, and my debut comes out in December, and it's all about cyborgs, so that's what I'm going to be talking about today.
And I'm Michael G. Williams. I write queer-themed horror and science fiction, including about queer monsters and about queer robots. And I grew up in Appalachia. These days, I am a writer, and I also co-host a podcast called Arcane Carolinas about myths and legends from this region. So there you go.
Absolutely fascinating. I always need more podcasts to listen to. My day job is so boring. But let's go ahead and get this panel started with our first question. What's the history on queer characters often being inhuman in fiction, or just inhuman characters being coded queer?
So, okay, I guess a little bit of reference. This is a big part of what I studied in school. And there's a very big history of obviously queer characters being coded as monsters, monsters being coded as queer, and just generally the depictions of the other as being villains, monsters, and human dead. Because those are your options when you're not going to be what you're supposed to. You get to lose or die. And then also, I'm sure for a pretty long period of time, there was that kind of loophole in like the Hays Code and those fun things of, oh no, he's not gay. Look, he's not even human. So it's been a thing for a while, and not always a good one.
I really wanted to talk about the Hays Code.
We can talk about the Hays Code so much.
Yeah, it was a code that came into Hollywood in around the 1930s through like the 50s. And it was basically like preventing anything perverse from being on the screen. So it kind of regulated queer characters to being villains and to being punished as the other. It was a really dark time. But bringing it back to like literary history, you can go all the way back to like, the foundations of sci-fi horror with like Frankenstein. There's some great articles I've read about Frankenstein being like kind of a trans allegory.
Plus, there's
If
Carmilla, there's Dracula,
yeah.
there's Frankenstein's monster. I just reread Frankenstein partly in preparation for this panel. And it was really interesting to me that we call the monster because of the movies. But in the book, Victor Frankenstein only ever refers to him as the demon. And I like that as a weird distinction. But for me, a big thing, it kind of goes hand in hand with the long-standing tradition of villains, even if they are human, being coded as queer. And I think that boils down to a really simple thing that like cishet society cannot express in a way that they are comfortable with. And that is the monster / the villain, they want what they want. And they're going to try to get it, even though they have been told they should not want it. And queer people, we get told we should not want what we want, and we're going to get it, regardless of what anybody tells us. And that is a form of power that disregards the rules that have been placed on us by the cishet society. And I think that they just are terrified of that. And so they're going to make stories where if the monster does what it wants, no matter what anybody tells them, then it must be queer. And if they're queer because and they do what they want, then they must be a monster.
Yeah. That's something that I was actually thinking a lot about in preparation for this panel as well, is this idea of like transgression. I have my notes open and I have in all caps transhumanism, transgression, transgenderism, right? That's kind of the idea of, because when I think about cyborgs, which is like my special interest, is thinking about transgression and trans allegory. I think you mentioned like the Frankenstein's monster, Frankenstein's demon being a trans allegory. And so thinking about that a lot in terms of transgression and going against the norm, going against what is good and right in society. And I'm thinking about it in terms of the Hays Code and what Michael said about like this fear of the monster being a queer person or a trans person. And so I think transgression was something that really stood out to me as I was like preparing for this panel as well.
Monsters are powerful, and we're powerful. I've
It's
personally,
that
I don't know,
unapologetic pursuit of their wants and desires.
Yeah. I've never really had a problem with the fact that monsters and villains are coded as queer, because they were the most interesting characters to me anyway. So I was really into that. I was like, yeah, give us the monster roles. Everybody else can go be the boring people.
Well,
Let us be the horrible things.
and they were the only ones with any sense of presentation.
Yeah.
So
we've touched a little bit on the sort of the power of this narrative, to some especially in the past, but also to some degree now. What do you think, what was the impact, do you think, of this narrative, of this idea that, you know, monsters and robots and villains in general are queer coded, that they have this ostentatious sense of style, this flair? I mean, as you were saying, Michael, I too was drawn to like the monsters and the villains and their just the way that they just, you know, they went out and took what they wanted and looked amazing doing so. I think I used to get obsessed with like the eyeliner, and I'm like, the sad realization though of like realizing I don't like anything near my eyes.
Same.
that's why I trailed off, because I was like, I was trying to wait to like give time for this question before I launched into the, like, they're the only ones with like the presentation, and if you keep giving us these stories and only these stories, eventually you're going to get that identification, and then eventually reclamation, which is I think kind of where we're starting to get. Because, you know, if you see something enough times and you go, oh, it's like me for, you know, for XYZ reasons, its story is something that resonates with me, and then, well, like, I'm already gay, so you're telling me that like I'm not supposed to find this thing, I'm not supposed to be drawn to this story, this narrative, and I'm like, well, at some point, if it's hot, like it's a slippery slope from there.
I feel like you're seeing a whole like the generation of people that were raised on that kind of literature and media. They're coming back and they're coming in, they're reclaiming that narrative and flipping the script, as it were. And you know, let's have the villains have happy endings.
Yeah. I think this kind of ties into, I think it's kind of bridging the way that we were talking about how it historically is and the way that it's sort of trending, the reclamation, and thinking about cyborgs, and in particular, because again, that's my special interest. I'm thinking about it in the sense of like modifying the human body and that dehumanization of like, as you are modifying your body, you become less and less human. And so this kind of like belief of queer people and trans people as being less than human, and then being able to take that back and do something cool with it,
You
and
mean
kind of,
people look at us and tell us that because we do things to our bodies that are unnatural, we're repulsive and not human?
it's weird. I don't get it.
I can't
because-
imagine anyone ever saying that to me.
No, it's crazy. But I think that gets to the cool thing. I mean, before we got on camera, we were talking about how cyborgs are so cool, and we're making all our cyborgs trans because all cyborgs are trans, and them's the rules.
Well, the whole genre of sci-fi, even though traditionally in the past you didn't see as much representation in sci-fi, but it's a genre that completely lends itself to representation because you can have societies that aren't based on the binary structure. You can just explore all the possibilities and the what ifs, and that's what the genre is for.
And in terms of the impact, I think that it's a knife that cuts both ways, because we get othered right out of the gate in these narratives. And for me, as a kid, that was in many ways very empowering. It was a way to find myself in the story. It's possible that I would have, if I had full, objective knowledge of like all of my emotions and the impacts on who I am that I would have preferred to have stories where I didn't have to be the monster to see myself. But I never minded seeing myself as the monster. So I found that empowering. But it also did give other people a language for how and why to hate us. And so there's a real negative impact to that as well. But for me, something really responded positively to it. I think that in our own lives, the language that gets used by the people who hate us and oppress us, it has to become something that we reclaim. We have to reclaim the parts of our experience that are that we're the most vulnerable to, as a way to defend ourselves. In just like real life, we have to reclaim words that are used against us. We have to reclaim stereotypes that are used against us. We have to reclaim narrative tropes that are used against us. And so there's no the fact that the impact of these metaphors is that a lot of other kids who read Dracula the same day that I did looked at it and said, wow, freaky people are bad. And I looked at it and said, I'm pretty sure this is about doing it. And the only guy who gets to do it the way he wants to is Dracula. So sounds pretty good to me. But I think all the people who looked at it and who were not me and had the reaction of, wow, I'm really glad I'm not weird. They got handed all the same tools that we did, and they would use them against us. I think our only option is to pick up those same tools and use them for our own good. I'm really radical about this stuff. I'm like, let's all go out and just like, if tomorrow we found out the vampires existed, I would be so mad if Pride were anything other than a giant vampire conversion.
Yeah.
So that's me.
Honestly, if you live forever, there's no reason why you shouldn't be queer.
Just
Yeah,
right there.
I'm like,
Sign me
queer people
up.
need to get weird, and we need to get
Why limit
weirder, and we need
yourself?
to just get louder and weirder every day.
We need a whole parade float just for the vampires, and then another one
Yes.
for the cyborgs.
And then the
and then
cyborg
we just-
vampires.
And then the cyborg
Yeah.
vampires, and it just goes from there.
A merry-go-round.
Yeah.
But I do think an interesting thing about it is the cyborg angle, the robot angle, is that is a way for us to be represented metaphorically as subservient in a lot of stories. And that can be an impact that has. It can put us in the role of the helper. Now we're the best friend, we're the helpful neighbor, things like that. And so I think that there are risks and dangers in all of this and in seeing ourselves in all of this. But there are risks and dangers in being who we are in the first place. So we just have to be conscious of that.
If we keep talking about cyborgs, I'm going to end up down a Nier Automata tangent, and that'll take the whole thing.
Well, we can certainly move on to another question, though, as a humorous aside and a bit of a deep cut here, if you too watched the Buzz Lightyear Star Command cartoon, you'd know there are robo-vampires. And if you haven't watched it, you should. It's available places. I actually don't think Disney Plus has put it up yet for some reason. There is one dedicated person on Twitter who keeps tweeting about it, though, so respect to that person. Yes, in the distant future, we could maybe have cyborg vampires. I mean, we had a cyborg werewolf, and that was illuminating, is all I'll say. Next question. Let's see here. What are your thoughts on how, at least in the past, because I definitely have seen this changing in like current literature and stuff that's forthcoming. But what are your thoughts on how queer-coded monsters and robots tend to work alongside ableist tropes?
So going back to these portrayals being applied to anyone who is the other, that includes disabilities, that includes working as a tool of racism and just general catch-all bigotry. Because my favorite, least favorite, whatever example is J.K. Rowling's AIDS werewolves. But again, like there's many. You look at X-Men, you look at the different robots, and how that programming and defect, and you have been programmed for this purpose, and now you are broken, and now therefore you are bad. It gets hammered in over and over again. I mean, you've got just so many, like, because it goes back to if you're wrong, you're bad, and your place is to lose or to die. If you are not upholding this perfect, able-bodied, cis, white, masculine perfection, why do you even exist?
Like Blade Runner, where the robots in that story just wanted to live beyond whatever lifespan they were given by their creator. They wanted to continue and have like a full life, like a human life, and that made them the villains just because they wanted to live.
iRobot, same, you teach a robot to feel, and whoops, now it has feelings about what you're doing to it. And therefore it's broken because it's no longer a good little tool.
Yeah. I also, kind of going with the sci-fi theme of like the replicants and the robots and AI and stuff, I often see it in the context of like neurodivergent thinking as well, of like you're thinking wrong, you're thinking differently, and you shouldn't think that way. And I think it plays into that dehumanization again of like XM Moon was saying, like you're broken, you're wrong. And so, thinking about that ableism kind of being weaponized in a lot of sci-fi in that way.
Well, and even in fantasy, you've got the Fae and changelings.
Sure,
and
yeah.
autism. You're brain broken. You must not actually be human. The fairies took you as a baby and swapped you out with something wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, the difference requires some sort of narrative to explain it. And that narrative also conveniently provides a justification for discrimination.
And it's exactly like you keep talking about, Michael. Like you, yeah, on the one hand, have the terminology to like identify your experiences and feel connected to something, but at the same time, everyone else now has something to compare you to use to further oppress you and just be garbage.
Yeah, I mean, it's that experience of being a marginalized person and being told by whatever identity or set of experiences is not marginalized in that particular context, in that particular case, that, well, you're not good enough for the story to be about you.
Unless it's about the ways that the right people, the good people, the heroes defeat you.
Right.
It can be about the dragon as long as it's about how the good people defeat the dragon.
Yeah. The only way to avoid being destroyed is to live in subservience to whatever the majority is. So, you look at the any of the old like movie tropes of the Black characters are only allowed if they are being depicted as slaves in historical fiction, or as, servants, or as people who are, otherwise like explicitly sort of like kept in their place. And, the same is true of disabled people in a lot of stories, where they're really only allowed in the story if they're there to be an object of pity. They're not allowed to be people who have full agency. They're not allowed to be people who are, in fact, perfectly self-sufficient. They have to be somebody who requires help. They have to be something that requires something from outside, because they are not allowed to be whole people.
This is just I'm enjoying this panel. I'm just sitting here like, like a Spider-Man meme. Just okay. So I know we've really been talking about sci-fi and robots, and I'm loving it. Um, and so with this next question, we're just gonna keep talking about robots, which is like outside of robots too, because I'm actually really fascinated to sort of get y'all's thoughts on this. So what are some tips or suggestions on how to queer conventional sci-fi tropes? I know we've talked about robots, but one thing I'm also interested in is to sort of get y'all's thoughts on like one thing that kind of comes up for me with the work that I do in tabletop games is, there's a lot of alien worlds, and we all do our best to sort of queer things up and go beyond the gender binary, like you were saying, Kristen. So I'm just kind of curious what sort of tips or suggestions you would have on how to queer those kind of sci-fi tropes, I mean, there's also the fact that you have to consider colonialism that kind of comes with, oh, you've landed on this planet and I don't know, it's full of bug people and the bug people are all asexual or agender or something, and it's like they're confused by your need to have sex at all. And it's like, okay, I don't, it always kind of felt a little weird, so like a little bit in that, oh yeah, I'm asexual that I realized years later, but also in that this is kind of odd. Why are there always bugs? But yes,
You
tips or
know,
suggestions.
romance, the subsections of romance do a really great job sometimes of queering it up because they will take tropes like even fated mates. And fated mates don't have to have a gender specific, designation. They can be anyone. But it is definitely something that is a lot of fun to play around with. And just when you go into sci-fi or sci-fi as a genre, it's always about, as I said before, the what ifs. So you can take someone else take the floor with any trope here.
Yeah.
You're towing dangerously close to making me talk about Omegaverse on another panel.
Yeah. You're always, I feel like a lot of people, if you're in the sci-fi or like paranormal romance or that, monster fucker space, you're just like 2 thoughts away from Omegaverse at all times.
At any and all time. When is a monster not a monster? The poem that it's actually, I was today years old when I learned that poem, and the quote is it's a supernatural poem. It's a Winston poem.
Wow.
Speaking of sci-fi and queer monsters, but
Yeah.
sorry, Makana, you're about to say something, and I.
Oh no, you're good. Don't worry.
Megaverse.
It's always a megaverse. But I was just gonna riff off of the what if question, which is I literally wrote in my notes like the what if question, because I feel like a lot of good sci-fi is based on what if. And so in terms of like when the question of advice for people to queer sci-fi tropes, I think it's taking that what if to the extreme. Like I always talk about when I'm building a world, I think about, okay, so here's this world building thing. How does that apply to queer people? How does that apply to trans people? Like, okay, so our world has brain implants. Like our world has, laser cannon arms. Like, what does that mean for a trans person? What does that mean for a queer person? And so thinking,
next question. Hope this helps.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so thinking about it, that's sort of how I like to build out my worlds is like, okay, how does this apply to trans people? How does this apply to queer people? And I think that it's kind of like that, like as we've been talking about this kind of like what is the word? Oh no, what's the word? Reclamation, you're right. So reclamation of these tropes. So it's like reclaiming these sci-fi tropes and queering them in the sense of like taking them and pushing them to that what if. And I think about it as sci-fi has historically been this cishet white male space for so long. And so it's pushing that what if of, it's not just what if this is true of cishet white guys, what if this is true for everyone else?
I think it definitely opens up a lot of really cool space. Like I think Kristin mentioned earlier to make things like normative even, to open up, those queer normative dimensions and worlds and frameworks. And then, yeah, like you're mentioning, what happens then? What happens when, maybe it is a more gender expansive, a more relationship expansive and encompassing society, but there's still something wrong. There's still someone doing it wrong. And then what are the repercussions of that? And how does that play out in the narrative? And then how does it play out too, I guess, with encounters with other groups and other societies and other cultures, because there's always going to be someone doing it different. So then does that become a monster, or does it become something accepted, and looking at how those differences are kind of carried out between groups and peoples?
I think to some degree, it depends on for whom are you writing or presenting it. Are you writing this for a queer audience to get to have a different experience of seeing themselves in a story? Are you looking to write this for a non-queer audience and trying to like shake them out of their preconceptions? And if it's the latter of those two, then I think there are some really ham-fisted, but probably very effective ways of doing it, which is basically present cishet characters as being marginalized for being cishet, not because like the world is full of evil queers, but because, you know, they're in a circumstance where that's what makes them unusual and they've never been in that before. Don't let them, as they experience the story, feel comfortable in their majority. Just like don't let them have that experience, to give them the first taste of not being in that majority. And I guarantee it will flip their wigs on the spot. But if you're writing this for, you know, or presenting it or running it as a game for a queer audience, then I think like we see that and go, okay, yeah, well, that's my experience already. So show me something new. And in that case, in my own writing, what I try to do is find some aspect of the queer experience that I'm trying to represent, that I can think of a way to draw out of like that queer identity and present as occurring to this character for some other reason. So like I have a sci-fi detective series where the thing that makes the guy have the experience of being queer is not the fact that he's a queer person, which he is. He has, I don't know what the language rules are, so I will say he has relations with a guy robot in the course of things. And that's not the thing that makes it queer or weird. It's that his genetics are different. And so he is viewed in a very specific set of ways. His culture kind of sees him as really, there's like sort of half of his culture sees him as admirable, and half of his culture sees him as sort of an embarrassing throwback. And to me, that was just a way to try to represent living in a time when like there are nonstop anti-queer legislative efforts against us, and cis had to go to sports bars to watch RuPaul's Drag Race. Like I couldn't figure out, you know, how to represent that other than to like talk about there being something really inherent about him that some people really love and some people really hate, and he's kind of stuck in that middle. So I think that you have to, if you're presenting for a queer audience, you have to just work a lot harder to kind of either just like say, okay, we're just going to talk about what we're experiencing, or to dress it up in something that's more metaphorical so that we can have that experience of being surprised by seeing ourselves in the story. I feel like when we're surprised by seeing ourselves in a story, that sometimes we're like, when I'm surprised by seeing myself in a story, sometimes I'm annoyed I had to wait to figure it out. And sometimes I'm really delighted at getting to sort of unpack this present of a story and find myself in it. So. Thank you. Also, sorry, I'm a talker. I tend to like go and go and go.
You're good.
Okay, so we have been having a very productive discussion and I am loving it. So going back to the robot well again, um, you can tell there's a bias here because some of these robot questions were written by me, the Robo fan. But what are your thoughts on robots tending to be labeled as asexual and or agender? I didn't write that, but it was implied in my head.
I mean, that's half of the rules. They're either always AAA batteries, or the robots are mad horny in ways we can't even fathom. And they're both correct.
in a technical way, you could say the robots do not have a gender until they are assigned one in most stories. I mean, I would love to see more narratives where the robots explore their own gender, which I
I
think we're
wrote
starting
one.
to get. Yes. Like, yeah. Usually by society, they either remain asexual or they're assigned a gender. So I look forward to the more and more stories where they explore it themselves.
Yeah.
I think a really fun thing would be a story where the totally normal, expected thing, just like the bog standard experience of a robot or an android is, don't put yourself in in a box necessarily. Like get out there and live a little and see what you feel like once you've done that. And everybody around them being really supportive and really endorsing this. I say that in part because like one of my favorite little touches from Star Trek The Next Generation was when Data creates an offspring android for himself and says explicitly, I'm allowing my child to choose their own gender because it's their gender, you know. And I think that like building into a story that is the expectation that people are going to go out in the world and live a little and see what they like, try different stuff on, see what fits, and you can change tomorrow. It's totally cool.
Yeah. I think it's that double-edged sword coming in again with every robot is the AAA battery, as you said, which I'm stealing that. I think that it's very cool to be like, yeah, that robot belongs to me. That robot is me. And I think it's when every single robot is that AAA battery, and the only representation we get are those robots. It kind of lends to that dehumanization again, where it's like, I keep coming back to what we said about how like this cishet normative society is imposing these things upon us, being like, oh, this is weird and you were weird. And we're like, oh, that's actually really sick. And we like that kind of thing. So I think that it's more of like, we want more of everything. We want more of everything. So I think that to boil it down, I think it really depends on like who is telling the story, who is assigning this robot to be asexual, agender, and aromantic. Like who is assigning it? Is it a cishet making a judgment, or is it us doing the reclamation?
And I think that's very much the case even with the monsters, who's telling the story and how and why.
Yeah.
And also you said that
the
robot is me, and I looked, and I'm not home. I have my little 9S sitting next to my desk at home, and that robot is me. At home.
I think there's nothing wrong with it. As long as it's like you said, Makana, as long as it's not like the only option. There's nothing wrong with seeing ourselves in something and reveling in it, especially if we get to just like be gloriously whatever it is, if we are to be monsters, then let us be glorious monsters is what I say. But also like it can be very restrictive and very limiting. I one time at a panel on a panel at Dragon Con rather, a person on the panel who was ace said that they loved seeing themselves as the ship because the ship is always like huge and badass, and they hated seeing themselves as the robot because the robot is always there to clean up a mess. And that really stuck with me. That was like sort of the moment when I realized, oh yeah, we really are all always expected either to help or to need help in these stories. We're not allowed to just be. And so that I think that it's there's a real danger of creating a false binary by introducing that, especially if it's introduced mindlessly and it's just sort of like the default for the person who was reading the story to see themselves in those roles because nobody's thought about a better way to try to represent things.
One thing when we're robots and monsters for Hays Code reasons, and it's another thing when we're robots and monsters because they're cool.
Their rule, like cyborgs rule, like
I
that's
was
the
just
rules.
thinking of that. It's a really good example though of like a robot not being a helper and kind of being in the role of like the monster, allowed to explore themselves is from the Orville.
Oh,
Do you remember that show and how the robotic race was on that show? It was great.
I actually thought where you were going with that. I don't know why. I think it's because my friends have been talking about it recently. In a different Discord server, we were talking about that cartoon Sherlock Holmes in the 24th and half, 25th, and I can't remember what century.
I remember that one too.
Yeah, where he's like a cyborg now, and like Watson was also a cyborg. And we were just talking about it because he was just like, it's like Holmes was really attractive. We were like, Watson was really attractive too. I was like, yeah, as a kid, I was sitting very close to the TV, and it wasn't just because I was nearsighted. I think even was Moriarty a robot too? They were doing some weird things with that one season show, but it was fascinating too because it was like, Sherlock Holmes solving mysteries and crimes and stuff and playing the violin or such a fever dream. I think that came on like Fox Kids. But that actually is a perfect segue to our next question, which is what are some of your favorite or least favorite examples in terms of monsters, robots, queering them, that sort of thing?
I mean, the AIDS werewolves are definitely a big least favorite.
yeah, yeah. I was like going through my Rolodex of cyborgs mentally, preparing for this. And I think there's a bunch that I really like. I really love Seven of Nine. I think that
Mhm.
I think Seven of Nine, lesbian icon, love her to death. Um, and then I also you were talking about Nier Automata always being like one thought away. And mine is actually Mass Effect. Mass Effect is always one thought away for me. So Commander Shepard is one of my favorite cyborgs because she gets.
Spoilers.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm joking.
Spoilers for like
I'm
a
joking.
12-year-old game. But yeah, so Mass Effect is a huge inspiration, always on the brain. Um, even like Furiosa from Mad Max, kind of
Yes.
like a diesel punk kind of cyborg. That's really fun. Um, yeah, I just think they're neat. I like cyborgs.
And like on the monster front, we're definitely, I know Kristen's mentioned like kind of more the romance side, but there's definitely been a really good renaissance lately of monster favorable, I'll do the different F word this time, monster enthusiast stories. And a lot of
Yeah,
really good
I
ones,
was
especially in like indie spaces and self-pub spaces, a lot of really, really good maybe the monster actually does get to, maybe not be good and pure because that, introduces a whole other set of expectations and things that still don't necessarily need to come back. But the monster gets to have a good, cool, fulfilling life. It gets to have people who care about it. It gets to have, like more to the story. And I guess I'm kind of fortunate in that I've ended up friends with a lot of really cool authors who are doing a lot of that. So every so often I get another fun story in my inbox like, hey, can you read this? I'm like, yes. Yes, I will read this monster enthusiast story. Thank you.
I was actually thinking about how much of a big fan I am of the newest incarnation of The Interview with the Vampire and how gloriously gay it is on all fronts. Like it's always been a very gay story, but now it's letting itself be in the media as well.
I love it in part because they are just the evilest gays. And
So toxic for each other too.
oh my God. They're the unhealthiest relationship. Their found family is a mess. They would be the worst neighbors I could ever imagine having. I love everything about them. They are just a dumpster fire of a family. And in that regard, they are no different from any other family. And yeah, their body count's higher. But a lot of families in the suburbs have body counts too, frankly. And they just don't know it. They just pretend it's not true. And I think that it is so wonderful to see queer people who do not have to be good, They do not have to be nice in order to get what they want. They can just take what they want. And the world around them just has to get over it and like wait for them to outlive it, you know? Like everybody who objects to them just ends up getting outlived. So I love everything about them. They are so fabulous. I love the original books too. I'm like 7 million years old, so I loved the Anne Rice novels. I encountered them at exactly the right time in college. And a friend literally said to me, "You want to read these books," and handed me the first two because they were the two that were out at the time. And just have loved them ever since. But I also love Frankenstein. That was part of why I reread it recently. You know, he describes Frankenstein as like 8 feet tall, super ripped, just like glorious cascading curly dark hair, thick black lipstick, effectively. I mean, you know, sure, it's like rotten flesh, but it's like effectively, he's just super gothed out, yellow eyes, like everything about it. I was like, grease this dude up and throw him at the leather bears, and he will never come back.
Well, Victor
Like,
was trying to make the perfect man.
yeah,
That, you know, as a straight man does.
yeah. And right. Oh yeah, very straight, you know. And he's only gonna like marry his cousin that he's known since he was 4. Sure. And it's been arranged, and like his mother's dying wish was that this happened, and that's the only reason he's going to. He's definitely straight. But like everything in that book also is about how Frankenstein's monster is the only character with any agency. He's the only character who can make a plan and see it through. He is the only character who can actually get what he wants. Every time he threatens Victor Frankenstein with something, the Victor Frankenstein's answer is, "But what if I went out of town for the weekend? And maybe it would just blow over, you know?" And it doesn't just blow over. Instead, the demon just keeps telling him, like, "I told you what was going to happen, and now it's happened. So here's what's going to happen now. Give me what I want, or more bad things." So I don't know. I love those two. I love Anne Rice's vampires specifically, and I love Victor Frankenstein's demon as queer characters. I'm also a huge fan of Clive Barker's Nightbreed. Sorry, I just like jumped back in there after having said my piece. But Clive Barker's Nightbreed, the movie is called Nightbreed. The book has a different name. It's an astoundingly good movie about a community of monsters who live underneath a graveyard. I love everything about it.
I'm so glad you brought up that movie because it's one of my secret faves.
And if I guess if we're gonna go a little further beyond, you know, books and everything, and we're listing off the toxic divorced couples who I love dearly. I mean, you've got the Magnus Archives, which is a little bit out, but experiencing its fun renaissance with the second series. And then my probably original favorites, Charles and Eric, Professor, you know. Which again, talk about the just effusively transparent allegories. Excellent.
I feel like there's something really complex in a lot of characters that we choose to identify with, but that if you unpack it all the way, then it starts to get to, we love characters who are the only characters who are able to see the truth and speak it. And so a lot of times in a lot of stories, the monster is the only one who can see and speak the truth. In a lot of stories, the robot or the android is the only one who can see and speak the truth because they are outside of the experience of the human characters. This is kind of maybe a stretch. I don't know. I don't think it's that big of a stretch. But like the final girl trope, those characters are often huge queer icons, even if there is nothing about the character that is explicitly or even implicitly queer. But like you think of Laurie Strode from the Halloween movies, you think of Sydney from the Scream movies, you think of the stoner dude from Cabin in the Woods. You know, these characters who are, because they are outside of the mainstream in some way, they have had some set of experiences that is unusual. And those sets of experiences have given them the ability to see and speak the truth. I mean, down to the fact that Scream 2, like Sydney has been cast as the lead in a production of a play about Cassandra, a person who is cursed with the ability to prophesy accurately and never be believed. And she spends the entire movie saying, "It's happening again." And everybody one by one says, well, that's ridiculous, about 5 seconds before they get stabbed. So I feel like those characters end up really appealing to queer audiences because we look at them and say, oh, that's somebody who gets it. That's somebody who sees what's actually happening.
That also applies to sci-fi with like Ripley from Aliens and Sarah Connor from the Terminator series.
Yes, absolutely yes.
Yeah, there's a whole really cool history of queerness and monsters and horror, especially. That I feel like could be a whole other panel, but because you get into like Jennifer's Body and you know.
Even in Twin Peaks, the character of Laura Palmer, who, like, except for the movie, is dead the entire time, but is still the central character of the entire series. If you read the book that was written by David Lynch's daughter, Jennifer Lynch, Laura Palmer's Secret Diary, then she explicitly acknowledges her own queerness in it and talks about being the only person who sees everything that's happening in town. We're just like, that's what we do.
And I feel like you kind of almost touched on a point I was thinking about earlier too, with like when the monster isn't a monster, when it's a human who's wrong somehow for seeing the truth, for not behaving like they're supposed to, for transgressing against the expectations of the society, and therefore they are, even though they are human, branded a monster. And I think those are a lot of fun too. Looking at the human monsters and the question of what makes a monster.
Speaks to my deep-seated love of the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
I feel like we could have a lot of fun watching stuff together.
Yeah.
We should have a viewing show, a viewing party.
It's like MST3K where we're just like there offering our little commentary.
So just to sort of add to this conversation, definitely want to pour one out for all those poor fanfic authors for Anne Rice novels who were unfortunately grabbed by the gloaming hand of Anne Rice. That put me off writing fanfic for a while once I found that out as I was reading it, and I was like, why isn't there more of this? Oh. And it's like, well, maybe I'll just go over here in my anime section where they don't know we exist yet. But I think also, as we were talking about it earlier, about people who appreciate monsters as we dance around the censors, I do want to give like a quick shout out to, as we're talking about like positive media and whatnot, there is this excellent podcast run by two people I know, Cleric and Josephine, called Monster Lovers Anonymous. It's MFA, but we all know what the F stands for. Where they go through and rate monsters. It is excellent. I've listened to a few excerpts, but that's unfortunately not the sort of thing I want on my phone because people on the bus are nosy. So I don't want to explain that to the guy sitting next to me. But it is a fabulous podcast. I have so many friends who are big monster lover fans. My sibling gets on my case sometimes where, I'm right at that stage where it's like, I'm not a furry, but, I'm not into monsters, but, there's a couple exceptions. Gosh, no, but I fully agree with Interview with a Vampire. I read that when I was in middle school. So like 8th grade. Ooh, that was a while
like
back.
12 years old.
Yeah, I got it from my boyfriend at the time. He was like, "You like books?" And I was like, "I do like books." And he's like, "You like vampires, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And I read it and then immediately wanted to discuss it with him, and he had read it and he was like, "Oh, I'm not equipped to have this kind of in-depth conversation." And I was like, "That's fine." After a certain point, I was like, "Anne Rice is getting kind of weird. I'm gonna go back to my manga. I don't know what's going on here." That and my mom took my book. That was his book and was like, "You're too young to be reading this." And I was like, well, guess that's the end of that tale. But this has been an excellent panel. This I could just sit here and just listen to y'all talk about monsters and robots and sci-fi and queering things and improving things. And I have like so many things to catch up on and watch. I have not watched like, well, one, because I'm a horror weenie, so I haven't watched like any of Aliens, but I've been meaning to watch the Terminator series and check out Dracula. I don't remember if it's a yearly thing, but I know Dracula Daily was a thing for a while where you get emailed like a page of Dracula, and it was mostly just funny because people on Tumblr were like, "Is this guy gay? They're in a relationship, right? Are they
Which
not gay?"
one?
And then I was,
Which one?
Right.
I think it was Harkness. I don't the
Yeah.
guy trying to hunt
Paul
Dracula.
Harker and Dracula.
Jonathan is he's so straight and
I was like,
so
well, maybe
definitely
it's
not into Count
Tumblr.
Dracula that the second Count Dracula starts talking to him, he has to write to his wife about it. Like he's definitely not super into Dracula. Definitely not sitting up staring out of his bedroom window at the bedroom window of Dracula all night long, just waiting to see if the dude makes an appearance. Very heterosexual.
Not desperate at all either.
No, no. Mm-mm.
It's like that gosh, is it? I can't remember the name of the comic. I don't think it's Hark a Vagrant, but that one where the guy's like, I keep a photo of my nemesis next to me on my pillow, so it fills me with rage. And I'm like, that's kind of, I mean, all right, homie, if that's what you want to do. But that, I don't. It's like the inherent homoeroticism of having a rival, like Moon you were talking about earlier with Charles and Eric, and I'm just thinking of like someone I know made like basically a tabletop game to that effect, where it's like you and your opponent that you're constantly calling my old friend. I'm like, if you call someone your old friend, it's a little homoerotic. Um, but that's an entirely separate panel, of which we may actually have one on that, but I'm not moderating it. So uh, that was our final question. So I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you for listening to this presentation. This has been super illuminating, a lot of fun, just super joyful. I absolutely love getting to hear more about all of these topics. Uh, so with the time that we have left, I just want to go back around with our dear panelists. And panelists, if you have something you'd like to promote or share or call to action, um, I think this is going up in June. So all the calls to action that I had to plug really quick, I think will have already elapsed. So we'll just leave it to y'all. We'll start with you, Moon.
Yeah, so I'm in the middle of a kind of writing dry spell. But I'm in the process of editing another monster enthusiast story. This is one of those fun perks of my job. If you have monster enthusiast stories that need edited, send them my way. Because editing and producing them is one of my great joys in life. That said, yeah, hopefully before the end of the year, I'll have another monster enthusiast story of my own out. I do have a novella and a full-length novel out, as well as a gay traumatized robot story and an anthology, all available on my website, which will be linked. Social media, I'm very hit or miss, especially since the fall of Twitter, so that's kind of the best place to find me.
What next? All right. I'm currently in the middle of writing a queer paranormal historical romance series. So it's been a lot of fun. The first two books are out. First one's called A Bargain of Blood and Gold, and it's all about lots and lots of monsters falling in love with each other. And I'm also currently working on a sci-fi romance anthology with a bunch of other writers and writing a queer story for that with robots.
Yeah, I write queer sci-fi. I have a book coming out with Golance December of 2024, so about 7 months from now, or it'll be 6 months when this airs, but about 6 months from now. And that will be coming out in the UK in December, and then early 2025 in the US. It's a cyberpunk heist with a crew of Hawaiian, lesbian, trans cyborgs. It's all kinds of nonsense.
And I have to next year?
Yeah, yeah. But I hope that things will be out soon. You can find me on Instagram. I'm Makana_Yamamoto. That's where I'm most active. And I'm a Native Hawaiian Indigenous writer, so I feel like it is my duty in this moment to shout out Free Palestine, like now, ceasefire now. As an Indigenous person to an Indigenous people, I think that's so important. Books for Palestine has been fundraising and are doing a great job. You can find them on Instagram. And so I really want to take a moment to just use this platform to boost that. Ceasefire now, Free Palestine.
I'm Michael G. Williams. I concur strongly with what you said about Free Palestine and Ceasefire Now. I write queer science fiction. Stuff that I have coming out this year is going to be kind of a laundry list. I have a queer sci-fi horror short story in an anthology called Nevermore, where all the stories are inspired by the works of Edgar Allan Poe. And mine is about deep space exploration, inspired by the story Manuscript Found in a Bottle. I have a story called A Light Like Pain and Promises that will appear in an anthology called Southern Fried Cthulhu, which is all Southern set and Southern written cosmic horror stories, and mine is an Appalachian cosmic horror story. I have a novella, which will complete a novella series. It's going to be called The Last Scene of a Strange Career, and it is about modern day queer witches who are time traveling in San Francisco fighting a demon of real estate. And I am currently shopping around a horror novel called Contemporary Ancestors, which is an Appalachian cosmic horror novel about a guy whose mother is finally dead and he wants to sell her house and get paid for his trauma. And instead he's falling in love with the gay porn star next door, and her house might be haunted or worse. And then I have, last thing on the list, the third book in my sci-fi detective series about a queer street hustler and private eye in the far-flung future. And that's everything I've got. And you can find me probably mostly on Blue Sky as at mcmanlypants.bsky.social, because I have a Twitter that I never look at anymore because I do not like Twitter anymore or its current management. And you can also find me on Facebook as at McManlyPants.
Oh, I should say you can find me on Instagram mostly at Crazy Diamond with a K _writes.
Once again, thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate everyone taking time out of their day to check out this panel. This has been Monsters and Robots, Queer Reclamation. I've been your moderator, Basil. Also, as a Black and Indigenous person, I also want to +1 to Free Palestine, ceasefire now. I think the bundles have definitely closed by now, but there are 2 bundles going on for tabletop RPGs for Palestine, and then one for the video game industry in general, but I cannot remember that one. And then there is one going on for tabletop RPGs in West Virginia for trans rights. Tons of bundles. It's great. Go on Itch, find them. But thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the Discord server to chat if you have any questions with the panelists. Thank you. Bye.